So I'm starting a new series on Kotlin for Java developers. So you don't have to be a Java developer to benefit from the series, but it will help, and I will try to phrase things in such a way that you don't have to know everything about Java to learn Kotlin here. But I will be kind of comparing and contrasting at various points. So we're going to be using the latest Kotlin, the latest Java, and IntelliJ. So if you don't already have the JDK installed, if you just search for JDK and you go here, and make sure you choose JDK and not JRE, wherever that is. JRE is the runtime environment and doesn't have the compiler, so make sure you go here, you choose download JDK, and pick the appropriate download for your platform and download and install that. We're also going to be using IntelliJ, and if you just search for that, you download. There's the ultimate version, which you don't need and costs money, but if you choose the community version, just go ahead and download that. If you have the option to include the JDK, which Windows doesn't, but if you're on Linux, you have that option. It's up to you. We're downloading the JDK anyway, so we're going to use that one instead. And then once you have both of those installed, that's all you need. So after that, if you run IntelliJ, you should have a dialog that looks like this. The first time you run IntelliJ, there's going to be a lot of setup options, but you should get a view like this. And then we're going to create a new project, and we're going to use Gradle. So I'm actually using Java 9. It doesn't really matter. So long as you have Java 8 or later, it'll be a very similar experience. So we're going to use Gradle. We're going to leave this unchecked, and we're going to say we want Kotlin Java. It really should be Kotlin JVM, but anyway, this is what the option says. So I'm going to call mine so we're just going to do hello world. And we can leave all the settings on the default. So you might also, if you didn't get that create project dialog, you might also get this screen. Usually it starts out with the project collapsed here, but if you just click on it, then you can see kind of your directory structure. If you didn't see the create project dialog to begin with, and you're on this screen, you can usually hit close project, and that will take you back here. I'm going to go back to where we just were. Basically, anytime you see this Gradle projects needs to be imported dialog, I import changes because that's important. If you don't see your source directories and all that stuff here, go up here and click the synchronize button, and that will usually recreate all those directories for you. Okay, one last little thing before we get started. If you go here to your build.gradle, make sure that you're using the latest version of Kotlin here. I'm using 1.2.41, but there might be a later version available by the time you see this. But whatever, at least make sure it's this recent. We're not going to do that right now. Okay, so let's just get started with a basic hello world program. So this is your test, we don't care about those. So for example, I'm going to quickly start out with the Java version because it'll be important later. So this is how you, sorry, that was a bit fast. If you type sout and then hit tab, IntelliJ will expand that for you. Then if you run here, then it runs the program, says hello world, great. But this is about Kotlin, so let's get started on that. So the easiest way to really get started with Kotlin is to write a program or a file or whatever in Java, and then under Tools, Kotlin, okay. I thought it was going to be here. But anyway, if you hit Control-Alt-Shift-K, it will convert the file to Kotlin. And it'll give you some warnings, and you hit OK. And so now it's in the Java tree, but if we move it over to Kotlin, then that'll be better. So this is one way to have a main method that runs, and the key things here are object, which we'll talk about in later videos, but it's basically a singleton, and this is the main method here, and it's still called the same thing. So if you don't have JVM static, then this will kind of behave like a main method, but the JVM won't actually, sorry, it'll behave like a static method, but it won't actually be static as far as the JVM is concerned. It'll be static as far as Kotlin is concerned, but those are slightly different things. So if you use the JVM static annotation on any method inside of an object, it'll force to actually be a static method. So if you see here, generates an additional static method. Yeah, so this forces it to be static. This is a little, so okay, so let's run it to make sure that it works. Okay, still works. So this is of course a perfectly valid way to have a main method. But one thing that you can do instead is Kotlin lets you put functions directly at the top level like this, which is actually pretty nice. And here, in this case, you don't need to say JVM static, it just works. So Kotlin isn't magic. It needs to, like the code it generates, needs to adhere to kind of the same rules as the JVM. And in JVM and in Java, which kind of closely resemble each other sometimes, you can't have top-level methods. So how can Kotlin have top-level methods if the JVM doesn't support top-level methods? And you may have possibly been able to guess, but here we have, the file is called main.kt, but if you look at the program that we actually ran, it's a class called main.kt. Where did main.kt come from? Kotlin generated it based on the name of the file. And yeah, so anytime you have top-level methods, it will synthesize this class for you. So you can still have whatever class like this, and now you have a main class and a main KT class. It doesn't get nested or anything like that. Anyway, so besides looking at this, one of the most interesting key things you can do to understanding your Kotlin program is if you look under Tools, Kotlin, and Show Kotlin bytecode. So this will give you the actual like intermediate representation, which is kind of hard to read. You can kind of see what's going on, but it's needlessly complicated. But if you hit decompile here, then you can see, then it can turn that bytecode into roughly the equivalent Java source code. And here you can see it generates a class, so ignore all the metadata, it's confusing. It generates a main KT, and it has this public static final void main. You can see the final isn't really necessary. And this is everything that Kotlin is actually doing. And so we have our hello world string. Again, like, it doesn't necessarily actually create a variable. It's not perfectly one-to-one what the bytecode is and what the Java decompiled is. This is an approximation. Anyway, so this is what's happening. So the last little thing that's interesting is notice that here it says system.out.println, despite the fact that we had println here. So if you control-click and look at the source code for this, this is so ignore the annotation, this is an inline function, println, that accepts a message, and then it calls system.out.println. So Kotlin has the notion of inline functions, and these are functions that are just, whenever they're called, instead of being an actual function call that the JVM does, the compiler will replace the code at the call site. It'll replace this println with the entire body of this method, which is just a single line here. So in general, usually you wouldn't do that in such a simple case like this, but because, I don't know, Kotlin, the JetBrains team decided that this should be inlined, just so that there's zero cost in calling println. Usually, if you were to write something like this yourself, though, it'll warn you that it's unnecessary. Let's say expected performance impact of inlining this method can be insignificant. Basically, the JVM, when it is running your code, after it's run your method a few thousand times, it'll automatically inline the code for you at runtime. So that's why this is kind of discouraged. But println is so common, it's so simple, that they just decided, hey, we should just inline this. So that's it. Next time we'll talk more about variables and types and stuff like that. So stay tuned for that.